Again, this is our my colleague Perry Sheffield in pediatric environmental health, part of the New York State Centers of Excellence in Children's Environmental Health, speaking on climate change as a quick summary from what I missed in the first go around. And I'll hand it over to Perry now.
Hi there. I am happy to be here. This is Perry Sheffield, and I'm figuring out how I can both show you all slides and also see chats, because I would really like to use chats during our session today. So welcome, everybody. It's nice to see the folks I can see. I can actually scroll through. Yeah, it's nice to see faces. And as Cappy said, I'm a pediatrician working in the environmental medicine department at Mount Sinai. And we work with two children's environmental health groups, one called the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, the PACU, and another one called the New York State Children's Environmental Health Center Network. Nice check, we call it. But today we are going to focus on a big transboundary phenomenon called global environmental change, of which Cappy teaches a full course. So this is just an overview, and if you want a deeper dive, then look for that course offering. I'll show you again that at the end. So we want to talk about some of these processes of environmental change, describe some mechanisms that are working through these processes of global environmental change to affect health, and then talk about how there are strategies for interventions on these, and we'll give a couple examples of those. So, and I've interwoven into these some mini career cases just to hopefully inspire you and show you some other folks working in this arena. So the biggest driver of global environmental change is us, humans. And as you can see from this world population growth chart across history, we had relatively stable human population for millennia. And then, due to massive technological, if you will, advancements in our ability to produce food and sustain populations over the last several hundred years now, we have seen this burgeoning population. And so it's not only just our total numbers on Earth that have really phenomenally changed, but where humans are living. And so in about 2010, the majority population no longer lived in rural settings. While there's still obviously hundreds of millions of people who do, the majority of the world's population, and that proportion is growing, live in urban or city areas. And this comes with some unique challenges. Certainly when we're in denser populations, the idea of infections, as we know well during this COVID time, can be more paramount. On the other hand, certainly pollution and certain types of environmental exposures can be more concentrated, but it also gives really exciting opportunities for interventions, because we know that the built environment becomes even more prominent in determining our health, our lifestyles and our health status. And so there's some very cool built environment interventions that are in the works that are transforming how people live in cities. Okay, so types of global environmental change. There are a number of them, and many of them are actually interrelated. This is a short list: biodiversity loss, deforestation, desertification, and ocean degradation, climate change, ozone layer depletion, and freshwater decline. But we're going to focus on two today because we have a short time, as sort of illustrative, and two of the biggest in my mind, and multifaceted: biodiversity loss and climate change. So the first career case I want to interweave into this before we jump into our first type of global environmental change is that of Aaron Mayer. And I chose to highlight him to one, show you a sort of an underrepresented face in public health in general, and particularly in environmental health. He's a Black man who works at, I think he's retired now, but worked at the New York State Department of Health, and he was the Sierra Club National President from 2015 to 2017. I also wanted to highlight Mr. Mayer because he worked in an area that wasn't automatically environmental health related. He did epidemiology and spatial analysis, but he is an avid hiker and loves to spend time, particularly in the Adirondacks. And I think it was through that and probably many other experiences that he came to be such an advocate in environmental health. And so I wanted to highlight him as someone who's sort of stepped out of his professional role or cross-pollinated in a really important way that we think we're learning ever more is critical for finding answers to our complex problems. Speaking of complex problems, I wanted to show you all this aerial view of a country border. I want you to put into the chat if you have any guesses about what two countries these are. This is an island nation. There are actually two nations on this island. That's a really big clue. And this is the border between the two. Any guesses before I give a couple more clues? Yes. Okay, nice. It is. It's the Haiti-DR border. And the one on the left, or the western side, is Haiti. The right is Dominican Republic. And this, I show this powerful image to illustrate 2 points. One is, once deforestation, environmental degradation has sort of kicked off the cycle, it is a cascade of problems, because if you can imagine that there's a heavy rainfall event, the resulting erosion and potentially landslides or mudslides that would occur on the deforested Haitian side could be devastating, right? And they further take away very important fertile soil that can grow further, either just vegetation or food crops specifically. And they can cause direct injury, certainly downstream of where that runoff goes. But this didn't happen just by chance. I mean, I use this example because this is obviously all in the same climate. It's in a very small micro area, not a big geographic area. And also, if you know a bit about history, you know that for the most part, the DR has had a fairly stable democratic rule, and that Haitian government has had autocracies, and it's also had a lot of foreign meddling, starting way back at the when the Haitian got their independence from France in the, I believe, early 1900s, and represented a threat to the United States. And the United States has invaded Haiti multiple times. And so they have served as a destabilizing force to the government there. And so just to sort of tie this to big picture as we start this conversation about global environmental change, that who we elect to our government and what foreign policy we implement has global impact. So if you haven't gone and voted, I hope that you get to do that if you are able to in America after this lecture today. Who knows where this is? Next time to chat in. This is a classic New York City space that, did it come? Yes, some of you have probably visited the Natural History Museum, the American Museum of Natural History specifically. And has anybody put in what specifically this is? Sorry. Okay, so sorry for that interruption. You're right, Hall of Biodiversity, exactly. So this is a beautiful spot, and to go and appreciate the wonderful, diverse structures of life forms. And these are what you see, obviously what you can see with the naked eye are the macro forms. And when we talk about biodiversity, these are fauna, right? So this is one tiny cross section of macro fauna, things that we can see, but not even including the other life forms. And all of those are important when we talk about biodiversity. So the actual definition is biodiversity is a measure of the concentration and the degree of variety among the forms of life in individual ecosystems and on Earth. And I want to drill down a little bit into ecosystems. So each of these photos are different ecosystems. And again, a chat. Thank you all for being game for this. Could you chat in if you recognize any of these ecosystems? There's the aquatic one. There's the very tall tree one. And then there's a desert one. Here comes. The redwood forest, coral reef. And I'm actually forgetting now, and perhaps the person who put in redwood forest, you know, I thought that the middle picture was sequoias, but it's definitely like a California huge tree ecosystem. So that could be right. And the Great Barrier Reef is correct. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to chime in on that. So off of the coast of Australia. Does anyone have a guess? Okay, baobabs, you're getting there. Yes. Anyone know specifically? So when you hear baobabs, particularly if you ever read something like The Little Prince, or for many other reasons, you might think of African landscapes. And specifically, this one is in Madagascar, actually. So the island nation that's off the eastern coast of Madagascar, of Africa, the continent of Africa, is the island nation of Madagascar. And they have baobab species that are endemic and not found on mainland Africa. And specifically, this ecosystem is called the Spiny Desert. It's an incredible place where the vegetation has come up with all forms of adaptive ways of conserving water to be able to survive in this very dry system. So these are ecosystems. So these have multiple organisms that are interacting with each other in a sort of balance. And thinking about sort of what's in it for humans, or as we start to understand our relationship to these ecosystems, we talk about it in terms of ecosystem services. And so an ecosystem service is a benefit that's provided by an ecosystem, such as something like clean water. So this is an example list of sort of the categories that we talk about in terms of ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, cultural, which has to do with both sort of spiritual, ritual, like habitual practices, and also things like recreation. And then supporting services, which are sort of much often at the microscopic level, but are critical for the sustaining of not only that ecosystem itself, but then what we draw from it or what we do. So I'm going to drill down a little bit more on these to give you some examples, more specific examples. But the part of the reason that we're talking about the biodiversity loss as one major form of global environmental change is because the thinking now is that we are sort of entering into what is potentially going to be considered the sixth mass extinction. There have been 5 over hundreds of millions of years. And while we're not at that stage yet, we do know that the rate of species extinction has gone up. I believe it's thousands fold in terms of the speed at which things are going extinct. There is a full governmental assessment that has been done on it that was just released this spring. The group that's referenced in the lower right corner there, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And my understanding is they work similar to a process that I'm much more familiar with around climate change, in which the member nations of the United Nations come together and basically volunteer scientists do a consensus process to make a statement around what the state of the literature and our scientific understanding is. And so historically, what has caused these mass extinctions that we've experienced, not we have experienced, but that the planet has experienced, were things like asteroids, huge volcanic eruptions. And then now we actually think, as I started this whole presentation, that that humanity is probably, that our activities, our collective impact of our activities is what's driving the current rate of extinction that we're seeing. And so we want to talk a little bit about why that matters, because there's still lots of things around. There's millions of species of things. And so why does it matter to human health specifically? Can we tell that story? So this example is taken from a beautiful book about biodiversity and health. And these little guys are called cone snails. Can you show me can you react by raising hands or clapping or something? What are they and why do they matter? They're cute, they're pretty. This might be something you collect on a beach, but how does it relate to human health? Cone snails do this thing. They're actually predatory creatures that harpoon their prey in order to survive. They harpoon it, but it's not just a physical injury. They don't just spear it through the heart and kill it that way. They actually harpoon it, and they inject a very potent, basically painkiller or an opioid derivative. Here, that was a diagram. Here's a photo of it doing the same thing. So they attack. And it turns out that those chemicals that they use, they're different in all the different kinds of cone snails. And they represent, sorry, I said an opioid derivative. It's actually the opposite of that, non-opioid derivatives. And why this is important, kind of stole my own punchline, why it's important to human health is because we, as over the last decade plus, when we started recognizing pain as the sixth vital sign and really started increasing how we address pain in healthcare settings, have inadvertently created the opioid epidemic in this country and beyond. Many of you probably have personal experience with this, and a huge driver in that. So the impetus was to better manage pain. But a huge shortfall is that the toolbox that we have as medical professionals to manage pain is relatively limited, and particularly contains a lot of addicting substances, particularly those in the opioid families. And so having alternate pharmaceutical pain relievers that are non-opioids is really important. And so this is a pathway about drug discovery. And so many ecosystems where cone snails live are endangered. With the disappearance of these goes potential new drugs that could help us address issues like the opioid epidemic, which is also a pediatric issue, even though children themselves are not the population that is typically getting addicted. The rates of treating pregnant women with opioids has increased. And so the rates of something called neonatal abstinence syndrome, in which babies are born basically pre-addicted to pain medicines, has gone up considerably. And so this is also, speaking as a pediatrician, a pediatric environmental health issue. Okay, so then to put it in some examples, I used just gave you that example of a missed opportunity for drug discovery when we, and down there on the left is, actually, can you chat it in if anybody knows what kind of flower that is, and also why it matters? Why is that type of flower important to human health, and particularly around drug discovery? In the middle is a inflammatory reference about the movie Contagion and the idea of when there are disrupted ecosystems that potentially organisms that weren't in contact with each other previously. Good guess, it's not foxglove for digoxin, but that is another important one for making cardiac medicines.
Is this the flower that's the cure for the bubonic plague?
No, it is. I don't think so. I don't know what flower that is. Does anybody else? I see impatiens, and I don't know if that one has a drug property. This is definitely think about the ethnopharmacological perspective. The reason that flower on the lower left is the rosy periwinkle, also from Madagascar, I will say. Vinca, I believe, is the scientific name. And it is used in treating childhood leukemia.
We got Ben Christine, I assume, from Vinca.
Oh,
Isn't that the name of the?
maybe so. Right, that's the chemotherapeutic agent, isn't it? Maybe so. That's I don't know if I ever made that connection.
I'll look it up.
So those are two examples about missed drugs opportunities, and you guys are chatting in some other ones, which is great. The emergence of new or spread of existing infectious diseases. Somebody liked the movie Contagion. Could be a good one to watch in this time period if you're not terrified enough. Food insecurity and loss of potential for a balanced diet, particularly in traditional communities where there is a primary staple and there's a lot less variety in diet. I had the opportunity to live outside of the United States in rural communities as during college and other periods. And many times the question was like, what is your staple? Back to me. And sort of as a college student, I didn't like staple. It was like not even like I eat different things every day. Many of us do. But a staple grain is very common in many parts of the world, whether or not that's millet or sorghum or rice, certainly, or cassava. And sometimes it's not a grain, but a root. And so if those crops are threatened, or if there's micronutrient changes due to changes in carbon dioxide concentrations, for example, that can be a significant threat to malnutrition. The mangroves on the far right, lower right picture, serve really important role in flood protection. And then I alluded to, but also this idea of loss of ecotourism. Many people are, many communities are have a lot of economic input from other people coming to see what is special, whether or not that's the leaf peepers of the New England in the United States or certain parts of the Caribbean or certain, we could go on and on about sort of important places and why people go there because of those landscapes and the biodiversity there. Okay, so as I was talking, did any examples come to mind, or can you suss apart what's down at the bottom of the picture here in any way to give an example of an ecosystem service? And I don't mean the technical term like provisioning, regulating. I mean like a very specific one. Put in a few examples of like, if anything I said jogged your memory about either a personal experience you've had, like of a ecosystem that is a place you would go do ecotourism yourself, or go because the landscape is the way it is, or like an activity that is important, and it can be just like a pleasurable activity.
So Perry, you're harkening back to your previous example of an ecosystem service being, for example, fresh water. Is that correct?
Sure, that's an important one. So the filtration process, right? The service, but the service can be so that would be a provisioning one, right? Or a regulating one. I can't remember what category they put that into. And then there's things on the very sort of, as I mentioned, like microscopic level, like a nitrogen cycling, which are critical for sustaining life, but probably less top of the mind. Okay, great examples coming in. So some rainforest people maybe have actually gone or just think of them as really important, like the Amazon, going snorkeling, yes, on places like beautiful reefs, Dead Sea, skiing, right. So seasonal changes, which are being impacted potentially by things like climate change, are actually really important for our sort of how we make meaning and share experiences and feel connected to sense of place. Natural shade, yes. Right. So some of them are, oh yeah, like New Zealand's landscapes, exactly. So some of the ecosystem services are very so overt and things that we think of in our things that bring, landscapes that bring us peace or pleasure. And others are much more sort of invisible or insidious and also very important. All of Iceland, yes, beautiful landscapes are getting called out there. Okay, so so most of the ones that got named, or I would put probably in like the cultural services category here, like those are, sort of recreation, but not to belittle that at all. These are really important. And then some of the ones that are happening sort of the behind the scenes. It's almost like in the Wizard of Oz, if you pull back the curtain, the other stuff that's happening. So in the category of provisioning services, Cappy mentioned actually water cycle is down and supporting. So in provisioning services, we can think about timber, for example, where we get wood. Or we had mentioned, now I'm going to give some examples on the right. So the drug discovery potential. In regulating services, flood control is a really important one. I mentioned mangroves, so flood risk mitigation. But there's also things like carbon storage and climate regulation. This is one of the connections to climate change here. We'll talk a little bit more about climate change in just a minute. Under cultural services, there are significant mental health benefits of being in nature. We're starting to understand that better, particularly if you feel connected to a specific landscape. And then food security. So here's where the water cycle that Cappy mentioned, and then also thinking about nutrient cycles, or just the very act of what plants do to make their nutrients, the photosynthesis. All right, second career case, this time it's a threefer. These three white guys have what in common? I wouldn't really expect for any of you to know them, but maybe. They all have work currently, lead, or have been involved with the Harvard Center for Health and the Global Environment, which is a really cool, innovative center doing a lot. And particularly, I'm going to call out the pediatrician of these three, Ari Bernstein. So these three guys are a pediatrician, a chef, and a meteorologist. They are specifically Ari, who wrote this book, the beautiful book that I got the cone snail example from, called Sustaining Life, about biodiversity. He's a pediatrician. Barton Seaver, he's a chef, and has done a lot about thinking about sustainable diets. And so how to, because diets probably more than even landscapes are sort of, part of our identity. And so he's trying to think creatively about how we can make subtle shifts in that way. And whether or not it's recipe substitutions or other things to still have that food that is comfort for us and our routine things, but also puts less pressure on things like certain fish populations. And then the third guy is somebody named Jack Spangler, who is an atmospheric scientist or meteorologist. And so all three of them, as I mentioned, worked at this Harvard Center. And one thing I wanted to highlight, one product that they started a couple of years ago, is a monthly newsletter they produce called The Climate Optimist, which is a really creative and actually pretty upbeat newsletter information source that you can sign up for if you're interested. At their C-change is the acronym for their center. They're pretty fun, good writing in this newsletter. So then we pivot. That was a bit about biodiversity. And I started to sort of foreshadow how it's linked to climate change. But we wanted to do a deeper dive here. So the way I like to kick off is the very thing, this greenhouse gas effect that we talk about as like the underlying cause of climate change, or the mechanism behind it, is actually really critical to having life in general on the planet Earth. Because if there was no blanket of atmospheric gases, the average temperature on Earth would be negative 18 degrees Celsius all the time. And so it wouldn't be super conducive to us enjoying many of those spaces that just got named on our ecosystems we love. But it's this same system that's been that the balance is being thrown off. And so more energy is getting trapped inside this, inside that Earth system that you can see on the left side there with its little fuzz around it, which are the blanket of gases, our atmosphere. And it's leading to, despite what you might see in sort of the theatrics of politics, It's leading to more energy in our climate system. And that can be even extreme snow events, because snow events are just precipitation events when it's cold. And so extreme snow events are really consistent with what we would expect from where you have more blanketing gases around the whole planet. And so the more solar radiation that comes in, less of it gets re-released back and out into space. And so when you have more energy in a system, it revs up cycles. And so that's the wind cycles and the evaporation cycles that drive weather patterns on planet Earth. Okay, so to kick off this conversation, because we want to link this to health, I want you to type in, please, what comes to mind. And you can type in that you don't know any yet. That's okay. We can totally start at blank slate. But I have a feeling that pretty much everybody has something when they think how climate change is bad for humans. Why? And you could type in an image of who. I think we health professionals are somewhat late to the game in really calling this out, because it used to be that the poster child around climate change was about polar bears. Skin cancer, I see rolling in. Fires in California, yes, that's been very topical and timely. Emissions and asthma, heat stroke, heat waves, heat illness in elderly populations. Australia, I assume that was referencing maybe fire too. Vector-borne disease, respiratory problems. Good job, everybody. Heat exhaustion, allergies. Okay, you're coming in so fast, I can't even read. Oh, yes, and somebody took it from climate change through droughts, fires, carbon release, climate change, more fire. Yes, a cycle that builds on itself. Okay, how about benefits? Anybody got benefits? We flip it. So what do we stand to gain if we do things that reduce climate change or protect ourselves from climate change? And we got clean energy, sustainable policies. So say why these are good for health. Those are some of the solutions. Absolutely. Okay. Oh, for seasonal affective. So yes, all right, fair. That's fair. So I think the answer about seasonal affective disorder may be being diminished. So thinking about, and this is a really important conversation to have about when we talk about health epidemiology work around climate change. Some people argue not all the effects will be bad. Like some places where you couldn't grow certain crops, you might be able to grow crops. Or we know that right now more people die in the winter than in the summer. And so, yes, there actually will be a slight decrease of deaths in the winter. They have studied that, and each time, all the studies that I'm aware of, when they've done a comparison, particularly the one that I've seen most vetted is around heat, for example, heat and cold and the offset. There's still a net increase in deaths related to heat compared to the decrease that we will see, a slight decrease in the winter. Yeah, good. Okay. So I'm just scanning all these great answers that you guys are putting in. Okay, so one thing I want to tease apart a little bit is, well, at the end, I think you all saw at the beginning the list of different sort of types of global environmental change, and biodiversity loss and climate change, and ozone depletion was one of them that we're not unpacking so much today. But ozone up high in the atmosphere, not down here where we're breathing it because it is not good for our lungs, but up high in the atmosphere, it actually serves a good purpose, that it's protecting certain types of ultraviolet radiation from coming in, and that is linked. And so the depletion of that ozone layer was linked to increased skin cancer. And the main driver of that ozone depletion, the main driver was chlorofluorocarbons. And one of the huge international successes has been the near phasing out of those chlorofluorocarbons. And so that's where we've made a lot of progress. And actually that ozone, the hole in the ozone layer is actually starting to mend. And so those climate change actually does somewhat drive that process. It's interrelated. But climate change more speaks to, while we're also talking about the atmosphere, it talks to the increase, the buildup of gases that are holding in heat or energy. So slightly different, but slightly interacting processes. Okay, so when we talk about health effects of climate change, you all named a bunch of them. Let's see which ones came up already and which ones that maybe didn't. So when we say climate impacts, we're actually talking usually about weather. And so it's a little bit of a misnomer. So the climate changes weather, and the weather typically is what has the direct health effects. So whether or not that's more intense heat waves, stagnant air masses or air pollution from changing weather patterns, or more frequent rainfall events, are three climate related, and sort of directly those can impact humans by either causing heat stress and cardiovascular disease events, asthma, somebody mentioned, or direct injury like drowning. Yep, somebody just mentioned the flooding. Exactly. But then there's this other area indirectly, and those can be through basically sort of a couple steps. And so those could be kind of more conceptual, like we talked about effects on or upstream key ecosystem parameters, which might change vector-borne disease or zoonotic disease, sort of that balance in ecosystem and whether or not those critters are starting to live in different altitudes or in different geographic areas that then expose humans more. Through heavy precipitation, we could get directly injured, or a couple steps down the line, it could change our exposure to waterborne pathogens or trigger harmful algal blooms. That's usually precipitation plus warming. There was a water system in Ohio a few years ago that had to shut down their operations because the algae that was growing in the surrounding lakes that were feeding their water system had gotten so overgrown. That's also often fed by like fertilizer runoff that fertilizes the algae, so to speak, or causes something called eutrophication. And then the third example is an increase in areas affected by drought could have this sort of downstream effect of changing food availability. We also know that more carbon dioxide in the air, so not way up in the atmosphere, but literally down here where we're at ground level, often serves as a plant fertilizer, and it can change the nutrient content in food away from some of the important nutrients or protein that people need. And some of those processes where there's food insecurity can ultimately cause people to try to seek other places to live. And so that, or through sea level rise, is a huge cause of climate-related migration or climate refugees. And so now we just flipped that little left to right pathway that we're looking at vertically. And so now we have climate drivers at the top. Through those exposure pathways, which I condensed as like different weather things happening or upstream events, to the health outcomes down in the maroon box at the bottom. But this graphic also acknowledges that there are sort of the environmental institutional context on the left. So all these things like how we use land, like I just mentioned, harmful algal blooms, but how much fertilizer we're using in the surrounding crop zones around an area that's affected by harmful algal blooms influences that as well, for example. And then on the right is the social and behavioral context. And we know that individuals come with their own sets of demographics that contribute to their resilience or vulnerability to these exposures. And we know that the effects of climate change are not equally distributed. Both the contributions of greenhouse gases, represented on the top graph, the darker shaded countries have contributed higher emissions per capita to our carbon history of emissions. And we know that certain gases like carbon dioxide have very long half-lives in the atmosphere. So once we've burned stuff, it's up there for decades, if not centuries. And then in the bottom, these pictures will get bigger in a second to show you a cool distortion to illustrate this. But on the bottom is one fairly conservative estimate about mortality impacts from climate change. And then again, you can see that it's really like almost like the photo negative of the above picture in terms of where the impacts will be globally compared to where the contribution to climate change has happened. And so this picture takes away the color, but then distorts the land size of the country by where either, again, contributions on the top, but impact on the bottom. And this is one of the reasons why we talk about climate as a global justice issue in terms of who are the contributors and who are the impacted populations. You could probably do something fairly similar within the United States also about who sort of is driving versus who are the fence line or the frontline communities in terms of experiencing the impacts. And then I want to pivot and close with the solutions idea, thinking about mitigation and adaptation. And typically these words mean mitigation means mitigating or stopping climate change, so reducing your emissions. And adaptation means climate change is happening and we need to take action as a public health community to bolster our population to be prepared for it. And I would argue that they're not mutually exclusive, and they are both critical ultimately for protecting public health. And the Lancet has highlighted this. In 2009, they framed it as the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And in 2016, they came out with a lot of the same content, but they flipped it to a positive message that tackling climate change could be the greatest health opportunity of the 21st century. And part of that has to do with because reducing pollution associated with fossil fuel combustion is going to have massive health benefits, whether or not it changed the course of climate change. As we know, air pollution is such a powerful health driver. And so a couple examples related to that and how we're sort of unpacking it locally. So thinking about children's health and vulnerability to heat and ozone in New York City. The picture on the left is all the little black dots are where we have air pollution monitors in New York City. Not 100% of the time, they're on 2-week rotations, but they've been rotating these monitors to these, I think it's 150 sites over the course of almost a decade now. And so we have incredible understanding of how and where pollution, and they measure about 7 different pollutants, where the pollution is, where it's coming from, and they've also been able to study how it changes when there are policy changes, like the heating oil ban of the most polluting heating oil that happened 6 years ago now, and they were able to see like nearly immediate air quality improvements and estimate health benefits based on that. The picture on the brown shading has to do with traffic density, because that's one of the biggest drivers of a number of pollutants in the city. On the right, it flips to ozone attributable asthma hospitalization rate among children. And you can see it's not evenly distributed. There's hotspots in East Harlem, parts of Central Harlem, and then to the Bronx, and then over in Brooklyn and out in Queens and parts of Staten Island. And the link between heat and ozone is because ozone is one of the few pollutants that's not directly emitted from smokestacks or tailpipes. It's what we call a secondary pollutant. So it comes from other pollutants that are then in the presence of heat and light converted into ozone. And so we know that as weather gets warmer, more ozone gets formed, basically, especially during the summer, what we call the ozone season. And then it's interesting to look at and start to crosswalk this. And some of the work that we're doing is trying to better understand the relationship between social stressors, depicted here as major crimes per 10,000 on the left, blue shaded map, and poverty by community districts on the right. And you can see that there's certainly some parallels between the asthma hospitalization burden and these social stressors. And so we're starting to try with some of our research to try to understand these interrelationships to better emphasize the role that these social phenomena, if you will, play in health and how it interacts with these chemical exposures. And then some of the work that we do actually looks at projections in how climate change will change things like ozone in order to be able to make health projections. The idea being that we can, one, tell the story better and also better prioritize resources. And so we've talked about some of the interrelatedness of these different things like climate change, relating to biodiversity. Those are the two we highlighted today, but I just wanted to acknowledge that some of the other things that folks have mentioned, and then some of the other things that have come up in the examples, like the Haiti-Dominican Republic border, are interrelated with these global environmental change phenomenon. The third and last career case I want to highlight has as a shout out to American Public Health Association. All of you are eligible to be members, and they have a really powerful annual conference and then a lot of ongoing programming and lots of free webinars. And specifically, it's easy to get kind of lost in the huge network of APHA, especially if you've never been to one of their conferences and you go and there's like about 11,000 people there and you're kind of lost, but the advice is to sort of figure out what your section is. And so, and it's not written in stone, but to find sort of an area. And the one that I've been involved in is environment over the last few years. And that's a way to find a smaller group who have sort of some common interests to what you're interested in. Is a great way to network professionally and socially. And what I wanted to highlight from APHA is their new Center on Climate Health and Equity. I am honored to serve on their advisory board, and these are a couple of the other members who are friends and colleagues, and I just wanted to lift them up. So Natasha DeJarnette was formerly at the National Environmental Health Association as one of their directors, and she's just taken a faculty position at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. And Jalon White Newsom used to work actually with a New York-based environmental justice organization that some of you might be familiar with, We Act for Environmental Justice. She was their DC like legislative liaison at the time. And she now works at a foundation. So she's part of the funding entities who fund some of the environmental health research called Kresge. And then before we close with just a couple solutions examples, again, I wanted to kind of make these connections. So we've talked about climate change, and we know through things like altered precipitation. I just want to make these really clear how these different changes are connected. Oh, cool, I see people posting more things. These are just rolling in. Yes. Hold on, okay, I'll come back to that in a second. Actually, maybe it'll work in with this. So climate change through different mechanisms like altered precipitation affects biodiversity loss and ecosystem functioning. We talked about how one of the ecosystem function is about filtering water. And so with loss of vegetation in some areas or sort of collapse of different ecosystems, it can lead to a freshwater decline. We know that has a direct effect on human health. Some other phenomenon, land degradation. So we know that as literally the color, the surface color of certain land changes or how much is vegetated, it changes both the reflectivity and the evapotranspiration. So the which translates to a temperature. And so that can drive climate change and like weather patterns, like micro system weather patterns. And then we know through that and through agricultural productivity that can directly affect human health. And then the last one was I mentioned this and I wanted to circle back to it because somebody had mentioned skin cancer in particular. So stratospheric ozone depletion interacts with climate change, slightly different phenomena, but interacts and also can affect, so humans aren't the only one who are negatively impacted by greater ozone radiation, right? Sorry, not ozone radiation, greater ultraviolet radiation that comes through when there was a depletion of ozone. And so that affects biodiversity. That's that dotted line around the left. So again, I'm kind of beating this point home a lot, but I want to help hopefully pique your interest that how interconnected many of these phenomena are and how many of them come to interact with human health. So two examples, two quick examples, and I'll wrap up. This one is a project that I was involved in with partners in Gujarat and the Public Health Institute of India, as well as the US-based nonprofit, the Natural Resources Defense Council. And they do a lot of climate work in India, and a lot of that is focused on sort of the mitigation angle that I mentioned. So they are working with the government to think about their building codes, as there's many buildings, like a huge proportion of the country's buildings are getting built, are estimated to get, that will be built in the coming decades. And so they're working very hard to make sure that those are going to be sustainably built and energy efficient and all those things. Those are important angles. This other angle that they took was to do this project focused on heat. And when we say heat in Western India, it's like nothing compared to, I see some nods, compared to heat in New York City. The first time that I visited Ahmedabad, I think they said it was 104 degrees when we landed, and that wasn't a big deal. It was like 9 o'clock at night. Just to put it in context, when it's 95 degrees for more than 2 days in New York City, we declare a heat emergency, right? But in Ahmedabad, they actually had experienced in 2010 a heat wave. And for them, that meant several days of sustained temperatures in the 100 teens. And so it had even gotten their attention, despite being a community that is very resilient to very hot weather. And so this was a collaborative effort with the municipal government there to roll out an emergency heat response. And first, part of it was just doing the epidemiology to see if there was a heat impact. And we actually did document, and when we did a retrospective look at temperatures and hospitalizations and particularly mortality, we saw thousands of excess deaths during that period in 2010. So we were able to, local data is so important to convince people that something is relevant to their community. And so we were able to document that and then work in concert with health providers and municipal agencies to roll out both when they were going to set their threshold out, how they were going to communicate that, and what they were going to do. And that meant in some cases bringing water trucks around, opening parks for longer hours, setting particular occupational standards for their like traffic cops and other people who are working outside. And so a whole toolbox of response techniques and raising people's awareness about the issue. And then the last example comes full circle back to the built environment. I mentioned that more than half of the world's population and a growing proportion live in cities. And while this has some unique exposures and sort of worse health risks that come with it, there's also potential, incredible potential for health benefits. And so this diagram is showing a safe street design where there is outdoor dining, like many of us have seen in New York in the last few months, but there's more importantly, safe space for pedestrians and pedestrian-powered transport, the bikes in particular. And as Cappy points out, an even safer method would be to put the car parking between the moving cars and the bikes. So there's even less contact between the two. So there's lots of different ways to design this, but there's lots of great evidence that when there's really intentional design about thinking about these multimodal forms of transportation, there is increased pedestrian powered transport. There are less accidents, and there's subsequently a decrease in emissions when traffic patterns go down as well. That's it. Just a plug for 2 more courses if you want more on this, more about children and environmental health, or specifically more on global environmental change. Look for these courses typically offered in the winter or spring.
Spring 1 and spring 2. Yep.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, the terminology. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Could you just talk about the difference? So throughout the lecture, I noticed that we're talking about creating ozone in our atmosphere, but how does that also relate to burning a hole through the ozone layer in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, it would be great if the ozone that we created went up and got stuck in the atmosphere too. That would be like the perfect scenario, but it doesn't. Ozone is a volatile compound. Three oxygen molecules bound together, and so it gets so it's neither produced from combustion. It actually gets formed, as I mentioned, from like other volatiles interacting with each other when they're heated up. But then it also degrades pretty quickly. I mean, like on the scale of days, for example. And so it can be blown, actually, a really good argument for congestion pricing in New York City, meaning charging cars to drive into like lower Manhattan to decrease pollution in the city, is actually that it would improve ozone levels in southeastern Connecticut or southwestern Connecticut and Long Island, because most of the ozone that's generated from pollution that's made in New York City gets blown. The stuff that lingers gets blown out to surrounding counties. And so congestion pricing in New York City would actually improve air quality in the suburbs. And then to your question about ozone depletion, so there's tropospheric, that's here, ground level ozone. That's not good for us. When we breathe it in, it's a respiratory irritant. And there's stratospheric, so way up in the stratosphere, the higher level of the atmosphere, the ozone layer, same molecule, just different place. And up there, it helps block ultraviolet radiation from coming in, which is good for it. Actually, that ultraviolet radiation, it can cause skin cancer, but it also can degrade plants and harm other animals, and actually affect person-made structures. There's a whole part of how we analyze. This always gets me. Like, we don't. Thankfully, we also consider health impacts when we think about air pollutants under the Clean Air Act, but a portion of the analysis and what factors into whether or not how we're going to regulate, or how strictly we're going to regulate, is determined on how the air pollutants affect things like buildings, and ozone also affects things like buildings. Fun little facts. Does that answer your question about the distinction between the two?
Thank you.
I'm seeing the Montreal Protocol comment. So the Montreal Protocol was the super successful international treaty for stopping the chlorofluorocarbon production. Eutrophication, unrelated to that, but thank you, Lorraine, is the phenomenon where there's like too much fertilization running off, like fertilizer running off into nearby waterways, and then an overgrowth of, basically it disrupts the ecosystem, and it's an overgrowth of plants, which then can kill the animals and flora fauna that live underneath it. So they can starve it of oxygen, actually. And then some more details about the Montreal Protocol. Oh, and a question. I don't know a lot. I think the question looks like it's about countries who are not honoring the protocol, if I'm understanding correctly. And I don't know about enforcement. Not if anybody else knows about that, feel free to jump in.
Any other questions for Dr. Sheffield? We covered a lot of territory, so don't be shy about asking for clarifications if any of those concepts didn't quite make sense the first time around.
I have a general question are there any policies that people actually follow regarding when there's a discovery that comes from the environment, like a new plant that has a pharmaceutical application, to actually protect those species? Because I'm just concerned that the cone snails are endangered because of other, environmental factors. And then once they found out that cone snails can be used for medicine, then they're just gonna kill all the cone snails to steal their properties. Are there any actual policies in place right now that prevents species that have pharmaceutical applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know a lot about that. I think that, I mean, I do know that trying to do preservation on a species by species level is usually ineffective. And so often it does have to, the advocates for the cone snails in this case would have to advocate for the protection of the ecosystems to support them. I mean, unless you're going to have a completely domesticated, like bred population, which we have done in some cases. But I think the point about cone snails, there's something like 80, at least 80 known species and others that they think. So some of the, some of the cone scales haven't really even like been discovered yet. But that's a great question of whether or not there's like international protocols for protecting, for like, you know, enacting protections. It's a good idea.
Thank you.
Where I thought one angle I thought you were going to go with, the question was about intellectual property rights, which is like a whole other fascinating angle. And I worked with a project in Madagascar, if you all couldn't tell from the presentation, that's a place near and dear to my heart, that had been started by an ethnobotanist, actually from Ghana, when he had done his PhD work in Madagascar, working with a traditional healer who had an incredible, like, encyclopedic knowledge of the specific rainforest where he lived. And he got international funding to actually do a conservation project there and to protect the intellectual property of, so he'd partnered with a pharmaceutical department at the local university, but they were very cautious because they, you know, there's big money in pharma. And so to kind of to your point, they were cautious about people being opportunistic, not so much coming in and destroying the landscape as much as the community not necessarily benefiting from drug discoveries that were going to result. And so they put a process in place for that.
What is your position on, can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's a little off topic, but related. Do you, higher penalties or even criminal misdemeanors for individual acts of pollution? Is that something that has been talked about? Like, so for example, I'm a recreational angler. I do a lot of recreational fishing, and we have a problem where certain species are overfished. And so there's a lot of debate in the community about what to do about it. And right now, it's essentially a small monetary fine. So if you're caught by, you know, a wildlife officer or a police, you know, person keeping a fish that you shouldn't keep, you have to pay a small fine. But there's growing sort of calls for making things like that have higher consequences. So like making them a criminal misdemeanor or things like that. I'm wondering if anything like that has sort of reached the pollution sort of community.
That's interesting. And I do think that people who use different landscapes recreationally are often the strongest advocates for those spaces, and then for the species you just illustrated, for the species they're in, because you understand. I mean, it's important to you, it's fun to you, and you understand. Like, I mean, I could wax philosophical about whether or not punishment works to curb behavior. That's a bigger question. Versus like when people get fishing licenses, mandating certain educational programming for them to try to increase the, you know, knowledge and appreciation, and just what impacts they're having. Because they might, you know, people might not get it in terms of whether or not, you know, how the disappearance of that specific species might upset the balance in the ecosystem, and it might have ripple effects potentially. Another part where I thought you were going to go with that was about, I thought you were going to say boating and like pollution from like electric, like outboard motors, right?
Yeah.
And actually there's some really exciting work happening with electrification. And I think that there's going to be, you know, we're going to see a lot more of it in the coming years. And whether or not that's electrification of vehicles, both on road and water vehicles, or even electrification in homes. Like I foresee a phasing out of gas stoves, not because there's a powerful anti-natural gas lobby, but more because we're starting to understand the health effect. Like while, you know, we might like the smell of sizzling things, that it actually increases the, cooking with gas actually increases the particulate matter in not inconsequential ways. And so what we're breathing and whether or not you have good ventilation systems. The Rocky Mountain Institute just came out with a report about that. And I think that California is following suit with potentially, like with new residential building, like in cooking situations requiring electric rather than gas. So I don't know anything about like misdemeanors or punishment of that, but I do think that there's, like, in some ways the technology is catching up to enable us to you know, make changes that would be less polluting and mandate those.
I'd like to thank Dr. Sheffield for the presentation today.
Thank you all.
Choices.
Thanks for participating.
We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.